Hi, everybody. My name is Oliver BOTAR, and I'm an art historian who specializes in the work of LÁSZLÓ MOHOLY-NAGY. I am going to be presenting a series of 3 lectures on Moholy-Nagy in celebration of the 125th anniversary of his birth. These lectures were requested by the Hungarian Cultural Center in New York. Thanks to them for asking me to participate in this worthy project. I just want to mention before I start that I want to recommend a video that's already been posted by the Hungarian Cultural Center in New York by Alexandra Karakas, which is a general overview of Moholy-Nagy's career and work. And so do have a look at that as background to even what I'm going to be talking about here. Okay, so I'm going to share the screen here. There we go. I'm focusing on Moholy-Nagy's the early period of his life today, the period up to when he left Hungary in late 1919. So he was born in what was then southern Hungary, Bács-Borsod. That is now part of Serbia. And that's where he spent his youth, actually, between Bács-Borsod and Mohol and other places in that general area. He was born into a Jewish family, middle-class family by the name of Weiss. So he was born László Weiss. And the family was middle class, but it had its issues, its problems. László had 2 brothers, and the 3 brothers grew up without their father, who left the family very early. So they were raised by their mother. And then when their mother moved in with their uncle, Gustav Nagy, then he became the primary caregiver of the 3 boys, and he was the one who was guiding their education and their development. And we can see a photograph of Gustav Nagy up on the screen right now. And also a photograph of László Nagy and his brother Ákos as high school students in Szeged. Because what Gustav Nagy did is he made sure that the boys attended the best schools, and the best school in southern Hungary, the best high school in southern Hungary at that time, or one of the best certainly, was the Szeged State Gymnasium, or academic high school, in the city of Szeged. So that's where Moholy-Nagy spends a number of his formative years, and he was fortunate not only in going to an excellent high school and receiving an absolutely outstanding education in the arts and sciences and literature and history in every way, in the German language and Latin, etc. And my late colleague, Lloyd Engelbrecht, has done wonderful research on this. His form master for the 5 years that he was in high school was the literary scholar János Horváth, who not only was the first scholar really of the poetry of Endre Ady, who was the most important Hungarian poet of the early part of the 20th century, kind of like the Yeats of Hungary. I would compare him to Yeats in Ireland. He also helped young László publish his poetry, his teenage poetry, in local journals. So really, this was a very strong base on which László's further career was established. In 1913, László graduated near the top of his class. Actually, his best friend, Arthur Bach, was at the top of the class. And he moved with his best friend to Budapest to study law at the Royal Budapest University. We suspect that this was not his first choice, that he would rather have studied literature at the time, probably, or art. But probably due to the fact that his uncle was a lawyer, this is what the family wanted, and this is what young László did. And he moved to a city, though, that was a thriving metropolis the metropolis really of Central Europe, along with Vienna at that time. It was a very quickly growing city. In 1913, it was really at the height of its boom. Of course, it was also an important center of culture, and it was also, of course, the capital of the country. And I'm showing you a photograph here by André Kertész of Budapest and during the teens. And Budapest was a center of art and of culture, of literature, but also of avant-garde visual art. And the most important group at the time in the city was the Eight on Yoltzak, who had a series of exhibitions during the early teens, and exhibitions that were controversial. They were very strongly inspired by the French Fauves. In fact, several of them, including Robert Béring, his future art teacher, actually exhibited at the first Fauve exhibition in 1905 in Paris. So they were very French-oriented. They were also strongly influenced by the work of Cézanne and Gauguin, both of whom had been exhibited in Budapest at this very important exhibition venue, the National Salon. And I'm showing you also an image from a satirical magazine at the time, Fidibus, where you see all these people standing on their heads or turning their heads upside down in order to try and understand this incomprehensible new language of art. And here are a couple of examples of works by the Eight, including a self-portrait of Robert Béring from 1906, from near the beginning of this period of what's now known as the Hungarian Fauves, and also towards the end of the period of the Eight, Dezső Cigány's Cézannesque self-portrait, actually even perhaps going beyond Cézanne, even towards Cubism of 1912. And here I'm showing you the cover of an exhibition catalog, two exhibition catalogs, one of Gauguin and Cézanne in 1907, and another of the exhibition, the traveling exhibition of the Futurists and the Expressionists that came from Berlin, from the Der Sturm Gallery, that was on display actually just a few months prior to Moholy-Nagy's arrival in Budapest, which would have been around the late summer, maybe August of 1913, in anticipation of his beginning his legal studies. So he begins his legal studies in 1913, where one of his classmates would have been Alfred Kemming, who features again in one of my future lectures. He became a very important collaborator with Moholy-Nagy once Moholy-Nagy was in Berlin in 1922. But at this stage, László Nagy is focusing on his legal studies, but he does sit in on the literary seminar of Professor László Négyessy, which was quite famous at the time, where he meets his fellow Szegeder, Ivan Hevesi, who becomes his closest friend right up until the time that he leaves Hungary in late 1919. One of the privileges he enjoyed by being a law student was that he could join the Galileo Circle at the university. The Galileo Circle consisted of young people who were medical and legal students, and the circle brought in all kinds of scholars and scientists and artists to lecture on various topics. It was definitely left-leaning, but it brought in important speakers, the cream of Budapest intellectual life at the time, which included people like the philosopher György Lukács, Arnold Hauser, the art historian, and Karl Mannheim, the sociologist. I mean, many, many important intellectuals. And he completed his first year of legal studies, re-enrolled right as the First World War, I should say, was starting in September of 1914. I'm showing you also a photograph here of László Nagy with Ivan Hevesi and his siblings, including Margit, his sister Margit Hevesi here in the middle, who the young László was in love with, and he was writing some of his poetry too, because he continued to write poetry, but now he was really orienting his poetry towards the work of Endre Ady. And the closeness of this friendship is demonstrated by this slide, where we can see two silhouettes done around 1918 that show Moholy-Nagy in his army uniform at the right, and Ivan Hevesi, who was not drafted into the army, and that they had these silhouettes made of themselves at that time to demonstrate the closeness of this friendship. So in May 1915, after completing the second year of his legal studies, László Nagy enlists in the army. Of course, the First World War is raging, and the Austro-Hungarian army is part of this war. So after his training in February of 1916, he is sent to the front in Galicia, and that's where he really begins to sketch. And he makes hundreds of sketches on military issue postcards. I'm showing you two of them here. One entitled Én or Me, a self-portrait in his uniform. And here you can see an actual photograph of him wearing that same hat and that same uniform as part of a group shot here of the unit that he served with. And at the top left, I'm showing you one of his postcard drawings that demonstrates an early interest in telecommunications technology entitled Telefonisch Galicia, in German, on the telephone in Galicia. That's from 1917. In June of 1917, he was injured during the Kerensky offensive in Galicia, and he is sent to convalesce. And by late July 1917, he returns to Budapest and enters the military reserve. And that's a period during which he can be active in Budapest in the literary avant-garde. In September of 1917, he registers for a third year of legal studies, and he also begins to co-publish with Ivan Hevesi the literary journal Jelenkor, which I'll talk about in a second. In early 1918, and just to run through his military career here, he was appointed an instructional sergeant in the Army Reserve. So this is after he finishes his convalescence, partly continuing his legal studies. And that allows him to travel extensively in Hungary, training people. And then in September of 1918, with the approach of the end of the war, he also ends his military service. So he's in Budapest off and on during the First World War, and this is the time when the second wave of the Hungarian avant-garde hits, and so the eight kind of fades out at this point, and another generation takes over, although there's an overlap between the eight and this younger generation. And this this generation is spearheaded by Lajos Kossuth, a very important figure, a poet, a working class poet with a very limited education, but who was quite brilliant and an amazing writer, and a poet who really revolutionized Hungarian letters at the time in a post-Adi kind of way. And his brother-in-law, Béla Ujc, the two of them published this first journal of the Hungarian avant-garde with very strong international contacts, and that is A Tett, the Deed, which is modeled on contemporary German magazines such as Die Aktion and Der Tat. And this journal didn't last very long. It was openly against the war, and it was shut down by the authorities. But very soon afterwards, Kossuth started a new magazine he entitled Ma, or Today, and this magazine was much more oriented towards the visual arts, but it continued to be a literary magazine as well, just like A Tett had been. And this reorientation towards the visual arts was important and would have important consequences for Moholy-Nagy himself. And we can see here how international this journal was. And it also was one of the longest lived avant-garde European journals. It actually lasted for 6 years, from 1916 to 1926. And in the 20s, in Exile, it became one of the most important avant-garde journals in Europe at that time, along with journals like De Stijl coming out of Holland and Der Sturm in Germany. The very first issue announced its internationalism with and I'm showing this at the upper left, with a cubist work by the Czech cubist Bohumil Kubista, but many other important works of the international avant-garde, inspired by that exhibition in early 1913 that Moholy-Nagy saw with his cousin Béla Út, where they saw the expressionists and the futurists. And we can see here in volume 2, number 5, a work by Franz Marc on the cover, and then volume 3, number 5, a work by Umberto Boccioni, the important Italian futurist sculptor. Of course, they also reproduced works by Hungarian artists, including works by people who became close friends of Moholy-Nagy, of László Nagy at this point still, by József Nemes-Lampét, but also by János Matisztőcs, Béla Út. I'm showing you a work here by Béla Út from this period, actually depicting Kossuth's sister, Therese Kossuth, and also Lajos Tihanyi, who had been, as we said, seen a member of the Eight, and who became a very close friend of Moholy-Nagy's around this time. But this is also the period when Moholy-Nagy was publishing this new journal called Jelenkor with Ivan Hevesi. And here I'm showing you the first issue of the journal, and we can see that the editorial committee consists of László Nagy, a couple of other writers, Árpád Garami, Béla Zsolt, Baranyai, József Baranyai, but also Moholy-Nagy's best friend from high school, Artur Bach, and the editor-in-chief was Ivan Hevesi. So this journal kind of modeled itself on Ma, I would say. It was an even younger generation, but eventually the two circles of these two journals kind of merged, as we'll see in a second. And here we see a photograph of Ivan Hevesi and another of László Nagy in uniform around this time. And Hevesi became one of the most important critics. He began studying sciences, but switched then to literature and eventually to art history. And he was the first art historian in Hungary to actually deal contemporaneously with the development of these avant-garde movements. Here's his book published in 1919 on futurist, expressionist, and cubist art. The cover designed by Sándor Bortnyik, who was emerging at that time as the most important artist in the Ma circle. But this was still a period when more important than the visual arts, well, László Nagy had drawn these hundreds of postcards, most of which he sent from the front, most of which he sent to his friend Ivan Hevesi, but he was also writing poetry in the style of Endre Ady, kind of slightly decadent, erotic poetry, but often with an interesting twist of kind of a fascination with communication technologies, with sound, with texture, and with other kind of a visual interest, which was manifest in this poetry. And these were being published in Jelenkor. I'm also showing you a photograph, a portrait of László by his close friend at the time, Erzsy Landau, who I will mention again later on. Ady was the center, however, of Moholy-Nagy's interest at this time. He really wanted to be a poet. And here's a photograph of Endre Ady and a title of one of his last volumes of poetry published during his lifetime at the, it's entitled A Halottak Élén, or At the Vanguard of the Dead, which expressed Ady's anti-war sentiments. And right towards the end of Ady's life, László Nagy managed to enter Ady's most personal circle, most intimate circle, and become a friend of his just prior to Ady's death. This must have been a very important event in the young László Moholy-Nagy's life, that he was actually able to make personal contact with his poetic model. But during these leaves in Budapest and elsewhere in Székesfehérvár, Moholy-Nagy continued also to sketch in addition to his poetry. We can see here sketches of his erotic exploits. This is from 1918. Here's a sketch of the Café Kovács in Székesfehérvár, one of the towns in which he was conducting training exercises. And here's a sketch of Roma musicians playing on the Budapest Corso, which was one of the main places for young women and young men to meet each other. So he was kind of enjoying the pleasures of big city and small town life during his leaves. This is a very important, we come to 1918, this becomes a really key year in his life. I'm showing you a self-portrait from around that time. It's actually from the year afterwards, from 1919. But I'm also showing you a postcard sketch of Lajos Kossuth here, entitled, ironically, Count Kossuth, Gróf Kossuth, but also a cover of the translation of Guillaume Apollinaire's book on Cubism, translated by Zsófia Dénes, who was a very close friend, possibly a girlfriend of Moholy-Nagy's at that time as well, in 1918. What's important about this year is that, first of all, he converts from his Jewish faith to the Calvinist faith, the Hungarian Reformed Church, on May 2nd, 1918. Interestingly enough, the Roman Catholic Iván Hevesi acts as his godfather. I don't quite know how that worked, but these are the facts. I'm just presenting them. And he also changes his name from the prosaic Nagy, which is one of the most common names in Hungary, to Moholy-Nagy. So Moholy at the time, with adding the Y onto Mohol, the town where he grew up in what is now Serbia, in old southern Hungary, the Y denotes, it's a place denominator. So it's kind of like von or van or de, and it kind of implies a gentry background. So Endre Adi himself was comes from a rural, kind of impoverished Calvinist gentry background. And in a way, Moholy-Nagy was remaking himself, was reinventing himself as this artist around the time that he was becoming more and more interested in visual art and becoming a visual artist, and less interested in becoming a poet. He's reinventing himself, giving himself a new name, Moholy-Nagy, and converting to Calvinism, which, by the way, was very common among Hungarian Jews, that they wanted to kind of fit in better into Hungarian society. And this was also a period of great political upheaval. Of course, the Austria-Hungary and Germany, the German Empire, lose the war. The family, this was very important for Moholy-Nagy's family, because his trust fund, which was set up for him and his brothers by his grandfather, sorry about that, was invested, as everybody, all patriotic Hungarian citizens invested in war bonds. Well, they lost their fortune, and so they no longer had this trust fund to ensure that they could, that he could continue his education. Meanwhile, all hell was breaking loose in Hungary. The king eventually was deposed, and on 16th of November 1918, the Hungarian Republic, the second Hungarian Republic, was declared. The first was declared around 1848, or that was a constitutional monarchy, but whatever, it was the Republic was declared. And here I'm showing you a photograph by Rudolf Balogh, one of the important photographers at that time, of the declaration of the Republic under the leadership of President Count Mihai Károly. And during that time, it was a very intense time politically. Here is a very avant-garde work by Moholy-Nagy, very expressionistic work by Moholy-Nagy, entitled a group of people sitting around a table. There's one Hungarian word for it, asztaltársaság, with, you can see here, the figure of Lajos Kossuth at the head of this, or the main figure around this, at this round table at one of their favorite cafes. And this is a demonstration of several things. Just like that portrait I just showed you before of Kossuth at the upper right, this was a demonstration that the Jelenkor circle and the Ma circle had, for all intents and purposes, merged. And here we can see a cover, a contemporary cover of Ma, showing a revolutionary work, kind of cubist, cubo-futurist, Hungarian cubo-futurism, which eventually was called activism, a work by Sándor Bortnyik, who became the leading artist at that time, entitled Red Flag. So everybody becomes radicalized during this period. And in fact, these radical artists, artistic circles, are not satisfied with the Declaration of the Republic, they come to support a more radical type of republic, which we'll talk about in a second. This was also the time when Endre Ady died in January 1919. And as I mentioned already, Moholy-Nagy was a part of the circle, and it was probably of Ady's closer circle, and it was probably through him that his close friend, possibly girlfriend, we're not quite sure, Erzsébet Landau, gained access to this circle and actually was chosen as the photographer to make this image of Endre Ady on his deathbed in January. I just want to mention here that Erzsébet Landau was one of the most important photographers in Budapest at that time, and she was a member of a circle of feminist photographers, and that'll come up later towards the end of my talk. So in February, late February, this republic, this Mihai Károly republic collapses amid attacks on the Hungarian state. There are foreign armies attacking the Hungarian state from all directions, and this second Soviet republic is declared. The first, of course, having happened in Russia. The second Soviet republic is declared. It was a union of the Social Democrats and the Communists. It lasted for 133 days. It was a very chaotic period. It was a very ambitious, this republic had a very ambitious, many would say an impossibly utopian kind of program. Anyway, it was a very chaotic period, but this was a very exciting period for these artists because they felt that there was the dawn of this new age was coming, and that they could participate in the construction of this new, more egalitarian society. So here's another photograph by Rudolf Balog with two people looking at this this poster welcoming the proletarian republic. And the artists responded very quickly with this manifesto entitled To the Revolutionaries, or Revolutionaries, issued on March 25th. And this was essentially the Moss Circle with the members of the Jelen Core Circle as a part of it at that point. It's very radical. It calls for only people of working class background being allowed to practice as artists in this new republic. Really impossibly, ridiculously radical, actually, because many of the signatories were middle class, like Moholy-Nagy and Ivan Hevesi himself, themselves were. So it was, of course, very, very utopian. But they did sign it. And the leading artist, as I mentioned at the time in the Moss Circle, was Sándor Bortnyik, who was also a member of Moholy-Nagy's close circle of friends. And here we see one of the revolutionary issues of Ma, published in 1919, with one of Sándor Bortnyik's works on the cover, and the sketch for this work, which is in the collection of the Salgo Trust for Education in New York. So Moholy-Nagy, we don't have a lot of information about Moholy-Nagy during the Soviet Republic, but we know that he was that it affected him very, very intensely. He remembers this as a period of intense emotions, a kind of a self-analysis. Does he have the right to practice as an artist during a period when a lot of people are having trouble finding food? But he certainly enthusiastically participates. We don't quite know in what capacity, whether he had an official role or not. It doesn't seem as though he did, although there is an apocryphal story that he was sent out to agitate amongst rural Hungarians in the farming communities, and not very successfully, but we really don't know for sure. What we do know is that he participated, from his brother's memories, is that he participated, for example, in the May Day celebrations, which were an amazingly choreographed public spectacle with parades. Here I'm showing you the float of the filmmakers, sports events. The parks were opened up for proletarian children, for working class children. Stories were read every evening, bedtime stories in the parks by very prominent Hungarian actors and actresses. it's very difficult for us now to understand how intense this republic was and how strange it must have been for this major European city to be suddenly transformed into the Soviet Republic. But it was never a complete transformation because there just wasn't time to enact all the utopian plans that people had for the city and for the country. But it certainly was a very exciting a time, and a very exciting time visually as well. The Soviet Republic issued an unbelievable number of pamphlets and flyers and posters, literally in the millions during these 133 days. It's really astonishing. Their sense for propaganda was powerful. And as the Red Army was organized to try and repel the invading armies, the armies that were invading the borders of Hungary, there was a really remarkable campaign. And here are two posters from this campaign, To Arms by Robert Bering, and this one here by Béla Uitz, read Soldiers Forward. And here is another poster. They issued many posters for many reasons. Here is a poster by Jolan Szilágyi that every factory should have a workers' militia or something like that. And here is a stand with some of these many pamphlets being issued. So this was also a period of turmoil in cultural life. Lajos Kossuth tries to play a very major role. He actually demands to become the dictator of culture in Hungary, which György Lukács, who was the Commissar of Education of Culture, of course, repudiated. But Kossuth gets into kind of a public shouting match with Béla Kun, who was the leader of the Soviet Republic, over the issue of culture and the independence of culture from politics. I won't get into this in detail, but you should just know that this was just a part of that revolutionary and chaotic type of atmosphere at the time. What was important for Moholy-Nagy was that he actually began to study art formally at this time. Probably in November of 1918, he enrolls in this private school that Robert Bering set up in his family's house in Budapest, in Bering's family house in Budapest. And this was extremely important for Moholy-Nagy, who was an artist who never attended art school. So here he went during the evenings. He studied with Robert Bering, who was, of course, a member of the French Fauves. Actually, he exhibited with the French Fauves in 1905, a member of the Eight. He was the best friend of Sándor Ferenczy, the Budapest psychoanalyst, who was very close to Freud himself. This was a very, very interesting and intellectually stimulating circle for him to be in. And Bering, we know that Bering taught with using Cézanne and Gauguin and the Fauves as the models for his students. And Moholy-Nagy focused on drawing and focused on these very kind of gestural and linear drawings where he tried to model to add kind of a third dimension to these bodies using these strong lines. And you can see how the cross-hatching and other aspects of these drawings were learned from his teacher, Robert Bering. I'm comparing here Moholy-Nagy's self-portrait of 1919, probably 1919, and comparing it to Robert Bering's self-portrait from the teens. And again, you can see how Bering is using these lines that he's taking from futurist and cubist types of art making at the time, and in order to model his own face, and how Moholy-Nagy is using a similar technique in his self-portrait. In other drawings, Moholy-Nagy goes out to the industrial suburbs of Budapest. And this was a political a stance on his part. He was, like other artists of the time, revolutionary artists, he was drawing industrial themes to kind of emphasize the future importance of industry to building socialism. He also begins to paint. Bering was, of course, a painter. Here's a painting of the Hills of Buda, now in the Antal collection. Here is an image from the Taban neighborhood in the Buda side of Budapest. And here is another painting of another industrial theme of a factory in the suburb of Óbuda, one of the constituent elements of the city of Budapest. And this painting, this is another one from the industrial suburbs of Óbuda, shows you the kind of work that Moholy-Nagy was really interested in doing at that time, which includes the use of the cubist technique of passage, that is taking shading a certain color from dark to light within an individual surface, which is outlined in black. And this was borrowed from early cubist work by Picasso and Braque from around 1906. Here we can see a bridge, the arcing lines of which are echoed in these representations of the hills of Buda in the background. And here you can see the bright blue Danube flowing, because this is probably a painting of an industrial island, an island with industries on it in the Danube, in the southern part of Budapest. And here I'm showing you a page from a book by Julius Meyer-Graefe, a Hungarian-German art critic of the time, about Cézanne. And Cézanne was very important. Also, Cézanne inspired the cubist in the use of passage. But also, we can see here a page from one of Moholy-Nagy's later volumes, The New Vision, where he is reproducing a painting of an industrial site by Picasso, which is very similar to the work by Moholy-Nagy. So these are the types of influences that are very important, international influences that are very important for Moholy-Nagy. But there were Hungarian influences as well, including the influence of the use of the very bright colors of his very close friend, József Nemes-Lampert. Here's a painting by Nemes-Lampert from 1916. And here's a painting by the member of the Eight, Ödön Máté, from 1910, showing the use of passage and an image of a suburban industrial site in Budapest. But also the paintings of Sándor Bortnyik were very important at this time. Here's Sándor Bortnyik's red factory and yellow-green townscape at the upper right, both of which Moholy-Nagy would have been intimately familiar with, not only because Bortnyik was a member of his close circle of friends, but also because both of these paintings were acquired by his best friend, Ivan Hevesi. So he would have seen these at Ivan Hevesi's apartment. And we can see similar techniques, use of passage. Bortnyik is more abstract, more they're more patterned, these paintings, but nevertheless, there is a very close resemblance. But Moholy-Nagy's paintings actually emerge when we compare them with works by his contemporaries, emerge as being powerful examples of activist painting at that time, which begs the question, why wasn't he included at the time in the MA exhibitions? Why didn't Ivan Hevesi write about him? This must have been a source of disappointment for Moholy-Nagy at the time. To conclude, I'm going to speak briefly about the last exhibition held at the MA Gallery. I didn't mention it so far, but the MA established a gallery already earlier, at which there were a series of really important exhibitions, mostly by Hungarian avant-garde artists. The last exhibition before the Soviet Republic collapsed in early August was held during July, and it was the photographs of an amazing photographer, Ilka Révai. She was a member of the circle of Erzsi Landau and of Hungarian feminist photographers, and her exhibition consisted of some 240 photographs, a remarkable number of photographs, mostly or almost all, in fact, all of them were portraits of the new socialist human being, as Ilka Révai put it in her statement in this exhibition catalog that you can see here. And here's an image by André Kertész from later on from Paris of Ilka Révai and her daughter. Her photographs were very close-up views of faces, a little bit pictorialist in their being a little bit out of focus still, but nevertheless moving in close just to faces, just on the faces of her contemporaries, in this case young women, but also members of the MA circle, Lajos Kassák, János Máca, Ivan Hevesi, Sándor Bortnyik, and there must have been many, many more portraits. In fact, possibly there was a portrait of LÁSZLÓ MOHOLY-NAGY. It doesn't exist anymore. If there was, unfortunately, her studio was bombed during the Second World War and she lost most of her work in Budapest. But nevertheless, this type of photography, which Moholy-Nagy would have seen, I would argue, becomes an important impetus for him later on when he adopts photography in the mid-1920s as one of his art forms. This is what he was exposed to, but he was also exposed via his friends, Zsófia Dénes, Ilka Révai, Erzsi Landau, to feminist ideology at the time, which I would argue later on plays a role in the development of his new vision as well. Just before he left Hungary, as the Republic, Socialist Republic was collapsing, he went back to Szeged. We don't know quite why, but probably just to get out of the Romanian army was invading Budapest, so I guess he didn't want to be there. He went back to Szeged, where he spent several months. He linked with local artists, especially Sándor Gergely. He had an exhibition with Gergely and his wife at this location in Szeged. He painted this portrait of a young lady that he was interested in at the time, Agota Fischhoff. He also drew a portrait of the important poet Gyula Juhász, who also reviewed this exhibition very positively. And the exhibition was even visited by General Tournadre, the leader of the French occupation forces of southern Hungary. And this photograph may or may not have been taken either in Budapest in 1919 or in Szeged. In any case, he decided he had to leave. Many of the members of the Hungarian Avant-Garde felt that they had to leave with the collapse of the Republic. I don't think that Moholy-Nagy had to leave. He didn't play an important political role, so he wouldn't have been in danger of any retribution, but he wanted to leave, I think, for career reasons. And around November of 1919, he left for Vienna. And that's where I'm going to end this first lecture in this series. Thank you for listening.